The men and women who wear the badge walk a perilous tightrope. On one side, the abyss of chaos. On the other, the precipice of corruption. They are the guardians of peace, the thin blue line that separates order from anarchy. Their duty to serve and protect, their burden to resist the seductive whispers of power's dark side. But what happens when the line blurs, when the guardians themselves succumb to the shadows they've sworn to vanquish? What happens when the shield of justice becomes a weapon of oppression? This is the unsettling narrative etched into the very fabric of American law enforcement. From the gaslit streets of New York City to the sun-bleached sidewalks of Los Angeles, the history of policing in America is a tapestry woven with threads of both valor and vice. It's a story of noble ideals tarnished by the corrosive stain of corruption, a relentless cycle of scandal and reform that continues to this very day. The genesis of American law enforcement was not born from altruism, but necessity. In the early days, the streets were chaotic and the need for order was paramount. The fledgling nation, still finding its footing, saw the rise of urban centers that quickly became melting pots of diverse cultures and backgrounds. In the burgeoning cities of the 19th century, teeming with immigrants and rife with poverty, lawlessness ran rampant. These urban areas were a stark contrast to the rural landscapes that many had left behind. The promise of a better life in America often clashed with the harsh realities of overcrowded tenements and scarce resources. Politicians, desperate to maintain control, struck a Faustian bargain. They were faced with the daunting task of managing rapidly growing populations and the accompanying social unrest. In their desperation, they turned to a solution that would have far-reaching consequences. They formed police forces, often hastily assembled and poorly trained, tasked with imposing order by any means necessary. These early officers were not the highly trained professionals we think of today. Instead, they were often local men with little to no formal training, armed with nightsticks and a mandate to restore order. These nascent departments, often operating with little oversight or accountability, quickly became entangled in the very vices they were meant to suppress. The lack of proper training and oversight created an environment ripe for corruption. Officers, poorly paid and under immense pressure, found themselves tempted by the very criminal activities they were supposed to combat. Bribery flourished, extortion became commonplace, and brutality was a tool of the trade. The early police forces often resorted to heavy-handed tactics to maintain control, leading to widespread abuse of power. This era saw the rise of a culture where the ends justified the means, and the line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. The line between lawmen and criminals blurred, a dangerous dance with the devil that would cast a long shadow over the future of American policing. This dangerous entanglement set a precedent that would haunt law enforcement for decades to come. The very institutions meant to protect the public became enmeshed in the criminal underworld. The passage of Prohibition in 1920 poured gasoline on an already smouldering fire. The nationwide ban on alcohol created a lucrative black market, and the demand for illegal liquor skyrocketed. This period saw the rise of speakeasies and bootleggers who were more than willing to meet the public's insatiable thirst for alcohol. The demand for illegal liquor created a black market of unimaginable wealth and power, and organized crime syndicates rose to meet it. Figures like Al Capone became household names, their criminal empires built on the profits of illegal alcohol. These syndicates wielded immense power, often rivaling that of the local government. Police departments, already susceptible to corruption, were easy prey for these criminal empires. The allure of quick money and the threat of violence made many officers turn a blind eye to the illegal activities happening under their noses. Some even became active participants, further blurring the lines between law enforcement and criminality. Politicians and judges, seduced by bribes and threats, looked the other way as gangsters tightened their grip on cities across the nation. The judicial system, meant to be a pillar of justice, became another cog in the corrupt machine. The influence of organized crime reached the highest levels of government, ensuring that their operations continued unimpeded. The law, once a beacon of hope, became a tool for the highest bidder, a perverse testament to the corrosive allure of power unchecked. The very foundations of justice were eroded, leaving the public disillusioned and distrustful. This dark chapter in American history serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. The spectre of corruption wasn't confined to the smoky backrooms of speakeasies and gambling dens. It wormed its way into the very heart of law enforcement, infecting every level of the justice system. From patrol officers on the take to detectives burying evidence for the right price, the rot ran deep. Internal affairs divisions established to police the police often found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered. Whistleblowers faced intimidation, retaliation, and even death threats. The blue wall of silence, a code of silence that protected corrupt officers, became an impenetrable barrier to justice. The public, once trusting, grew increasingly disillusioned. The badge, once a symbol of safety and security, became synonymous with suspicion and fear. The thin blue line, meant to protect and serve, had become a tangled web of deceit and abuse, a stark betrayal of the public trust. Perhaps the most insidious form of police corruption manifested in the systemic targeting and oppression of marginalized communities. Racial profiling, fueled by prejudice and unchecked bias, became a tool of terror. Black Americans in particular found themselves disproportionately targeted, harassed, and brutalized by the very people sworn to protect them. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s brought the issue of police brutality to the forefront of the national consciousness. Images of peaceful protesters being beaten, hosed, and attacked by dogs shocked the nation and exposed the ugly underbelly of American law enforcement. Despite decades of protests, legislation, and reform efforts, the struggle for equal justice under the law continues. The names of countless black men and women killed by police officers under questionable circumstances echo through the halls of history, a chilling reminder of the deep-seated racial disparities that continue to plague the American justice system. The seeds of corruption within American law enforcement were sown early, taking root in the fertile ground of the 19th century's political machine. This era, dominated by powerful political organizations, saw patronage, known as the spoils system, become the lifeblood of governance. Jobs within police departments, from the beat cop to the chief, were political favors, bartered and traded for loyalty and votes. This system fostered a culture of cronyism and self-dealing. Police officers, beholden to their political patrons, were often more concerned with maintaining their positions and lining their pockets than serving the public good. Laws were selectively enforced, with favors granted to those with the right connections and the willingness to pay. The poor and marginalized, lacking influence, bore the brunt of this corrupt system. The lines blurred between law enforcement and political enforcers. Police officers became instruments of the machine, used to intimidate opponents, rig elections, and silence dissent. This unholy alliance between law enforcement and political power eroded public trust, creating a breeding ground for cynicism and despair. The depths of police corruption in this era were laid bare by the Lexow Committee hearings of 1894. This New York State Senate committee, formed to investigate allegations of widespread police corruption in New York City, uncovered a cesspool of bribery, extortion, and brutality. Testimonies from officers, criminals, and ordinary citizens painted a damning picture. Police officers routinely accepted bribes from saloon keepers, gamblers, and brothel owners, turning a blind eye to illegal activities in exchange for a cut of the profits. Those who refused to pay were subjected to harassment, false arrests, and violence. The committee's findings shocked the public and forced a reckoning. While the reforms that followed were piecemeal and often short-lived, the Lexow Committee hearings marked a turning point. They exposed the systemic nature of police corruption, demonstrating its reach and the corrosive effect it had on American society. The passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, ushering in the era of Prohibition, proved a disastrous experiment that further fueled the flames of corruption within law enforcement. The ban on alcohol, far from eradicating its consumption, instead birthed a vast and lucrative black market. Organized crime syndicates, sensing opportunity, seized control of this illicit trade. They built empires on bootlegging, gambling and prostitution, accumulating wealth and power that rivaled legitimate businesses. Police departments, already grappling with corruption, found themselves outmatched and outgunned. The lure of easy money proved too tempting for many officers. They accepted bribes, looked the other way, and even provided protection to gangsters in exchange for a share of the profits. Prohibition, intended to cleanse society of vice, instead transformed it, pushing law enforcement further into the abyss of corruption. Section 4. The Rise of the Gangster. The Roaring Twenties, a decade defined by jazz, flappers and economic prosperity, also witnessed the rise of the American gangster to mythic proportions. Figures like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano and Bugs Moran became cultural icons, their ruthlessness and opulence captivating the public imagination. These gangsters understood the power of corruption. They cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, using bribery, intimidation, and violence to ensure their continued freedom and profitability. Police departments, riddled with corruption, became pawns in their deadly games. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which 7 members of Capone's rival gang were brutally murdered, shocked the nation and exposed the brutal reality of gangland violence. It also highlighted the complicity of law enforcement, some of whom were suspected of aiding Capone's men. The public, once enthralled by the gangster mystique, began to grasp the true cost of unchecked corruption. Section 1. The Wickersham Commission sounds the alarm. As the Roaring Twenties gave way to the Great Depression, the issue of law enforcement corruption reached a fever pitch. The Wickersham Commission, appointed by President Herbert Hoover in 1929, delivered a scathing indictment of American policing. The Commission's report, published in 1931, exposed a litany of abuses: bribery, extortion, police brutality, and a pervasive lack of accountability. It highlighted the corrosive influence of the third degree, a euphemism for the brutal interrogation tactics used by police to extract confessions. The Commission's findings shocked the nation, forcing a reluctant recognition of the systemic rot within law enforcement. Although its recommendations for reform were largely ignored during the tumultuous Depression years, the Wickersham Commission's work served as a crucial marker, a stark warning ignored at the nation's peril. Section 2. The Depression deepens the despair. The Great Depression of the 1930s exacerbated existing social and economic inequalities, pushing already marginalized communities to the brink. Law enforcement, often viewed as an instrument of the ruling class, became a focal point for resentment and anger. As unemployment soared and poverty spread, crime rates rose, leading to increased police presence in poor neighborhoods. However, this increased presence often translated into over-policing and harassment, further straining relations between law enforcement and the communities they served. The Depression years witnessed numerous instances of police brutality and abuse of power, particularly targeting minorities and the poor. Labor strikes, breadlines, and protests were met with violent crackdowns, highlighting the growing divide between law enforcement and the citizenry it was sworn to protect. Section 3. A legacy of discrimination, policing, and race in America. The history of policing in America is inextricably intertwined with the nation's long and troubled legacy of racial discrimination. From their inception, law enforcement agencies have been used as tools to enforce racial hierarchies and maintain white supremacy. In the antebellum South, slave patrols, the precursors to modern police departments, were tasked with capturing runaway slaves and suppressing any form of black resistance. Following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Jim Crow laws, enforced by police, relegated black Americans to second-class citizenship, subjecting them to segregation, disenfranchisement, and widespread violence. This legacy of racial bias continued throughout the 20th century, manifesting in racial profiling, police brutality, and mass incarceration. Black communities, disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, faced higher rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration for even minor offenses. Section 4. The Civil Rights Movement ignites a firestorm. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s brought the issue of police brutality against black Americans to the forefront of the national consciousness. Images of peaceful protesters being beaten, hosed, and attacked by dogs, broadcast into living rooms across the country, shocked the nation's conscience. From the Montgomery bus boycott to the Selma to Montgomery marches, law enforcement agencies, often acting in collusion with white supremacist groups, responded to civil rights demonstrations with violence and repression. The deaths of activists like Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, and the 4 little girls killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing highlighted the deadly consequences of racial hatred and police complicity. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked significant victories in the fight for racial equality. However, the struggle for equal justice under the law continued, as police brutality and systemic racism remained deeply entrenched within law enforcement institutions. Section 5. The Kerner Commission, a nation on the brink. The wave of race riots that swept through American cities in the late 1960s forced a national reckoning with the deep-seated racial tensions and inequalities plaguing the nation. The Kerner Commission, appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967 to investigate the causes of these uprisings, issued a stark warning. The Commission's report, released in 1968, concluded that the riots were a response to white racism and called for sweeping reforms to address racial discrimination in housing, education, and employment. It also highlighted the role of police brutality and discriminatory law enforcement practices in fueling the unrest. The Kerner Commission's findings were largely ignored by the Nixon administration, which chose to prioritize law and order over addressing the root causes of racial inequality. This failure to heed the Commission's warnings set the stage for decades of mass incarceration and the continued over-policing of black and brown communities. Section 6. The War on Drugs, a new front in the battle for justice. The 1980s witnessed the launch of the war on drugs, a campaign that would have far-reaching and devastating consequences for communities of color and further erode public trust in law enforcement. Driven by a combination of political expediency and racialized fears, the war on drugs shifted law enforcement priorities toward drug interdiction and away from community policing. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws enacted during this era disproportionately impacted black and brown communities, leading to mass incarceration and the decimation of families and neighborhoods. The war on drugs provided fertile ground for police corruption. The focus on drug arrests, often measured by arrest quotas, incentivized officers to prioritize low-level drug offenses over more serious crimes. Civil asset forfeiture laws, which allowed police to seize property suspected of being connected to drug activity, even without a criminal conviction, created opportunities for abuse and corruption. Section 7. police brutality from Rodney King to today. The 1991 beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles Police Department officers, captured on videotape by a bystander, shocked the nation and sparked a national conversation about police brutality and racial profiling. This incident was not an isolated one, but the fact that it was caught on camera made it impossible to ignore. The grainy footage showed King being brutally beaten by multiple officers, even as he lay on the ground, defenseless. This video became a symbol of the systemic issues within the police force, highlighting the excessive use of force and the racial discrimination that many communities of color had been experiencing for decades. The acquittal of the officers involved in the beating sparked the 1992 Los Angeles riots, a six-day uprising that left over 50 people dead and billions of dollars in damage. The riots were a manifestation of the pent-up anger and frustration of a community that had long been subjected to injustice and inequality. Buildings were set ablaze, stores were looted, and the streets of Los Angeles became a battleground. The riots were a desperate cry for change, a demand for accountability, and a plea for justice. The aftermath of the riots left the city in ruins, but it also left an indelible mark on the national consciousness, forcing the country to confront the deep-seated issues of racism and police brutality. The King beating and the subsequent riots marked a turning point in the public's perception of police brutality. It was a wake-up call that made it clear that the problem was not just a few bad apples, but a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. The public began to demand more transparency and accountability from law enforcement agencies. There were calls for reforms, for better training, for the use of body cameras, and for independent oversight of police conduct. The conversation about police brutality was no longer confined to the affected communities. It had become a national issue that demanded attention and action. The proliferation of video cameras and later smartphones with recording capabilities made it increasingly difficult for law enforcement to operate with impunity. The ability to record and share videos of police misconduct in real time meant that these incidents could no longer be swept under the rug. The public now had the power to hold the police accountable, to demand justice, and to expose the truth. This technological advancement was a game changer, giving a voice to the voiceless and shining a light on the dark corners of law enforcement. Citizen journalism and social media platforms provided new avenues for documenting and sharing instances of police misconduct, bringing greater transparency and accountability to law enforcement actions. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube became powerful tools for activism, allowing people to share their stories, to organize protests, and to mobilize support. Hashtags like #BlackLivesMatter and #JusticeForAll became rallying cries for a movement that sought to end police brutality and to demand justice for the victims. Social media gave the movement a global reach, connecting people from all walks of life and from all corners of the world in a shared struggle for justice and equality. Despite these advances, police brutality continues to plague communities of color across the United States. The names of countless black men and women killed by police officers under questionable circumstances serve as grim reminders of the systemic racism and implicit bias that persist within law enforcement. Each new incident is a painful reminder that the fight for justice is far from over, that the wounds of the past are still open, and that the struggle for equality continues. The names of countless black men and women killed by police officers under questionable circumstances, Eric Garner, whose last words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for the movement, Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager whose death sparked the Ferguson protests, Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy shot while playing with a toy gun, Walter Scott, shot in the back while fleeing, Freddie Gray, who died in police custody, Sandra Bland, found dead in her jail cell, Philando Castile, shot during a traffic stop, Alton Sterling, shot while pinned to the ground, Breonna Taylor, killed in her own home during a botched raid, George Floyd, whose death under the knee of a police officer sparked global protests, and many others serve as grim reminders of the systemic racism and implicit bias that persist within law enforcement. These names are not just statistics, they are human beings whose lives were cut short by a system that failed them. Their stories have become a powerful testament to the need for change, for justice, and for a society that values the lives of all its citizens equally. The fight against police brutality is a fight for the soul of the nation, a fight to ensure that the promise of justice and equality is not just an empty promise, but a reality for all. Section 8, the Code of Silence, protecting the shield at all costs. A pervasive code of silence within law enforcement agencies has long served as a barrier to holding corrupt officers accountable. This unwritten rule, rooted in a misguided sense of loyalty and a fear of retaliation, discourages officers from reporting misconduct by their colleagues. The Code of Silence creates a culture of impunity, where officers who engage in misconduct are protected from scrutiny and discipline. This not only undermines public trust in law enforcement, but also endangers the lives of both civilians and honest officers who are pressured to remain silent about wrongdoing. Breaking the Code of Silence is crucial for creating a culture of accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Whistleblowers who expose misconduct play a vital role in holding their colleagues accountable and ensuring that justice is served. Section 9. The thin blue line of protection money. The allure of easy money has proven a potent corrupting force within law enforcement. From accepting bribes to engaging in outright theft, corrupt officers have betrayed their oaths and undermined the public trust for personal gain. One of the most common forms of police corruption involves the protection of illegal activities. Officers may accept bribes from drug dealers, gamblers and other criminals in exchange for turning a blind eye to their operations or providing them with inside information. In some cases, corrupt police officers have gone beyond simply accepting bribes and have actively participated in criminal enterprises themselves. This can range from robbing drug dealers to running protection rackets. Section 10. The drug war's unintended consequences. The war on drugs, while intended to reduce drug use and crime, has had a number of unintended and deeply harmful consequences. It has led to the mass incarceration of people of color, fueled police corruption, and eroded public trust in law enforcement. The emphasis on drug arrests and convictions has created a system where low-level drug offenders, often struggling with addiction, are treated as criminals rather than as individuals in need of treatment and support. This has had a devastating impact on families and communities, particularly in communities of color. The war on drugs has also been used as a pretext for racial profiling and discriminatory policing practices. Black and brown people are more likely to be stopped, searched and arrested for drug offenses, even though they use and sell drugs at rates similar to whites. Section 11. The militarization of the police, a dangerous escalation. The militarization of police departments across the United States, fueled by federal programs that provide surplus military equipment to local law enforcement, has raised serious concerns about the erosion of civil liberties and the increasing use of excessive force by police. The acquisition of military-grade weapons, armored vehicles and other tactical gear has created a climate of fear and intimidation in many communities. It has also led to a more aggressive and militaristic approach to policing, as officers equipped for war are more likely to view citizens as enemy combatants. The militarization of police is a symptom of a larger problem: the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Section 12. From Ferguson to Minneapolis. The cycle continues. The police killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 and George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020 sparked nationwide protests and reignited the debate about police brutality, racial profiling, and the need for systemic reform within law enforcement. These high-profile cases, along with countless others captured on video and shared widely on social media, have exposed the deep-seated racial bias and lack of accountability that continue to plague many police departments across the country. The protests following the deaths of Brown and Floyd have led to some modest reforms, including the banning of chokeholds in some jurisdictions and the increased use of body cameras. However, true systemic change remains elusive, and the cycle of police violence and community outrage continues. Section 13. Erosion of trust. The high cost of corruption. The cumulative effect of decades of scandals, abuses of power, and systemic racism has taken a heavy toll on public trust in law enforcement. This erosion of trust has far-reaching consequences, undermining the legitimacy of the justice system and making it more difficult for police to do their jobs effectively. When communities lose faith in the police, they are less likely to cooperate with investigations, report crimes, or serve as witnesses. This can lead to an increase in crime and make it more difficult to hold criminals accountable. Rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential for creating a safer and more just society. This will require a multifaceted approach that includes addressing systemic racism, increasing accountability and transparency, and fostering a culture of respect and dignity within law enforcement agencies. Section 1. The cry for reform, a chorus growing louder. The tumultuous events of the 20th century, punctuated by riots, scandals, and a growing awareness of systemic injustice, made it abundantly clear that the status quo in American policing was unsustainable. The cry for reform, once a whisper from the margins, grew into a chorus too loud to ignore. Civil rights leaders, community activists, legal scholars, and even some within the ranks of law enforcement itself recognized the urgent need for change. They called for an end to racial profiling, greater accountability for police misconduct, and a fundamental shift in the relationship between police and the communities they serve. The demand for reform wasn't simply about punishing bad actors, it was about addressing the systemic issues that allowed corruption and abuse to flourish. It was about creating a system of law enforcement that truly lived up to its ideals of justice, fairness, and equal protection under the law. Section 2. Internal Affairs, Policing the Police. One of the earliest and most enduring responses to police corruption was the establishment of internal affairs divisions within police departments. These specialized units, tasked with investigating allegations of misconduct by their fellow officers, were intended to serve as a crucial check on police power. The creation of internal affairs marked a recognition that police couldn't effectively police themselves without a dedicated mechanism for rooting out corruption. However, the effectiveness of these divisions has been mixed at best. Internal affairs units often faced resistance from within their own ranks. The blue wall of silence, a code of silence among officers that discourages reporting on colleagues, often hindered investigations. Moreover, internal affairs units were often understaffed, underfunded, and lacked the independence necessary to conduct truly impartial investigations. Section 3. Civilian Oversight, Bridging the Divide. The limitations of internal affairs led many to advocate for greater civilian oversight of law enforcement. Civilian review boards, composed of community members rather than law enforcement officials, were tasked with reviewing complaints against police, conducting independent investigations, and making recommendations for disciplinary action. Proponents of civilian oversight argued that it provided much-needed external accountability and helped to rebuild trust between police and the communities they serve. They argued that community members with their lived experiences and perspectives were better equipped to understand and address issues of police misconduct. Opponents, often from within law enforcement, argued that civilian review boards were ineffective, lacked the necessary expertise, and undermined police morale. Despite opposition, civilian oversight gained traction, with various cities and states establishing their own models of civilian review, each with varying degrees of power and independence. Section 4. The Knapp Commission, a blueprint for change. The Knapp Commission, convened in New York City in 1970 to investigate widespread allegations of police corruption, stands as a landmark moment in the fight for police reform. The Commission's work, sparked by the courageous whistleblowing of officers Frank Serpico and David Dirk, exposed a deeply entrenched system of bribery, extortion and brutality. The Knapp Commission's findings sent shockwaves through the city and the nation. It revealed a department where officers routinely accepted bribes from gamblers, drug dealers and other criminals in exchange for protection and looking the other way. The Commission's report, published in 1972, detailed two types of corrupt officers: grass eaters, who passively accepted bribes, and meat eaters, who actively solicited bribes and engaged in criminal activities themselves. The Knapp Commission's work led to significant reforms within the NYPD, including the creation of a more independent internal affairs division, the establishment of a civilian complaint review board, and the implementation of new policies and training programs aimed at addressing corruption and misconduct. Despite the reforms implemented in the wake of the Knapp Commission, corruption continued to plague the NYPD. In 1992, following a series of high-profile scandals involving police brutality and corruption, the Mullen Commission was formed to investigate the extent of the problem. The Mullen Commission's investigation uncovered a culture of impunity within the department where corrupt officers operated with little fear of consequences. The Commission found that officers routinely lied, stole, planted evidence and brutalized suspects, often with the tacit approval of their superiors. The Commission's report, released in 1994, concluded that the NYPD was failing to police itself and that a rotten barrel culture had allowed corruption to fester. It called for sweeping reforms, including a restructuring of the department's Internal Affairs Division, the creation of an independent monitor to oversee the department, and the implementation of new ethics training programs. The Rampart scandal, which rocked the Los Angeles Police Department in the late 1990s, stands as one of the most egregious examples of police corruption in American history. The scandal, which involved a rogue anti-gang unit known as Crash, revealed a level of depravity and criminality that shocked the city and the nation. Officers assigned to Crash were accused of routinely framing suspects, planting evidence, stealing drugs and money, and engaging in unprovoked shootings and beatings. The scandal, which came to light in 1998 when a Crash officer turned informant, led to the conviction of over 70 officers and the overturning of hundreds of criminal convictions. The Rampart scandal exposed the dangers of aggressive, zero-tolerance policing strategies and the importance of strong oversight and accountability mechanisms. It also highlighted the need for police departments to address issues of racism and bias within their ranks. The latter part of the 20th century witnessed a growing movement within law enforcement to embrace community policing as a means of rebuilding trust and improving police-community relations. Community policing, a philosophy that emphasizes collaboration, problem-solving and building relationships between police and the communities they serve, represented a significant departure from the traditional reactive model of policing. Community policing proponents argued that by working closely with residents, building relationships, and understanding the unique needs and challenges of different communities, police could more effectively prevent crime, reduce fear, and improve the quality of life for everyone. Community policing initiatives took various forms, including foot patrols, neighborhood watch programs, community meetings, and youth outreach programs. While community policing alone couldn't solve the deep-seated problems of police misconduct and systemic racism, it represented a promising step towards building a more just and equitable system of law enforcement. Every instance of police corruption, every act of brutality caught on camera, every miscarriage of justice leaves an indelible stain on the badge and chips away at the public's trust. The cumulative effect of these betrayals is a deep and pervasive skepticism towards law enforcement, particularly within marginalized communities that have borne the brunt of police misconduct. This erosion of trust is not simply an abstract concern, it has real and tangible consequences. When communities lose faith in the police, they are less likely to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, or serve as witnesses. This reluctance can create a dangerous cycle, allowing crime to flourish and making it even more difficult for law enforcement to do its job effectively. The loss of public trust also undermines the legitimacy of the entire criminal justice system. When people believe that the system is rigged against them, that the scales of justice are not balanced, they are less likely to view the law as legitimate or worthy of respect. This can lead to a breakdown in social order and an increase in vigilantism, as people lose faith in the ability of the system to protect them. One of the most insidious obstacles to holding corrupt officers accountable is the pervasive blue wall of silence, an unwritten code within law enforcement that discourages officers from reporting on their colleagues, even in the face of egregious misconduct. This code of silence is rooted in a misguided sense of loyalty, a belief that officers must protect their own, regardless of the circumstances. It creates a culture of fear and intimidation, where officers who witness wrongdoing are pressured to remain silent, lest they face ostracism, retaliation, or even threats to their safety or careers. The blue wall of silence not only protects corrupt officers, but also endangers the public and undermines the integrity of the entire profession. When officers are afraid to speak out against misconduct, it allows a culture of corruption to fester and grow. Breaking the blue wall of silence is essential for creating a culture of accountability and transparency within law enforcement. It requires fostering an environment where officers feel safe to report misconduct without fear of reprisal, and where ethical behavior is valued and rewarded. The media plays a powerful role in shaping public perceptions of law enforcement. From newspapers and television news to social media and online platforms, the way police are portrayed in the media can have a profound impact on how they are viewed and understood by the public. For much of the 20th century, the media often presented a sanitized and heroic image of police officers, focusing on their bravery and dedication while downplaying or ignoring instances of misconduct. However, the rise of citizen journalism, the proliferation of video recording devices, and the growing awareness of systemic racism and police brutality have led to more critical and nuanced coverage in recent years. While the media's increased scrutiny of law enforcement is essential for holding police accountable, it can also contribute to a climate of distrust and suspicion. Sensationalized stories, graphic images, and a focus on negative incidents can create a distorted view of policing, leading the public to believe that misconduct is more widespread than it actually is. The advent of the digital age, with its smartphones, social media platforms, and online video sharing sites, has revolutionized the way we consume information and hold powerful institutions accountable. Citizen journalists, armed with nothing more than their phones and an internet connection, have played a critical role in exposing police misconduct and sparking national conversations about police reform. The ability to record and share videos of police encounters has provided a powerful counter-narrative to official accounts, often revealing a starkly different version of events. Videos of police brutality, racial profiling, and other forms of misconduct have gone viral, sparking outrage, protests, and demands for justice. While citizen journalism has been instrumental in bringing greater transparency and accountability to law enforcement, it is not without its challenges. Videos can be taken out of context, edited to fit a particular narrative, or used to spread misinformation. Moreover, the constant scrutiny and potential for public shaming can take a toll on officers' morale and make it more difficult to recruit and retain qualified personnel. The digital age has ushered in an era of unprecedented transparency, with vast amounts of information about law enforcement activities now readily available to the public. From police blotters and crime statistics to body camera footage and internal affairs reports, citizens have more access to information about their local police departments than ever before. This increased transparency has the potential to improve police accountability and build trust with the community. When citizens have access to information about how their police department operates, they are better equipped to hold their officers accountable and advocate for change. However, this new era of transparency also presents challenges. The sheer volume of information can be overwhelming, making it difficult for the public to distinguish between isolated incidents of misconduct and systemic problems. Moreover, the release of sensitive information, such as body camera footage of violent encounters, can be traumatizing to victims and their families. Despite decades of reforms, protests, and calls for change, the spectre of police brutality, particularly against black and brown people, continues to haunt the United States. The names of countless victims, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others, serve as grim reminders of the deep-seated racism and implicit bias that continue to plague law enforcement. The videotaped beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles Police Department officers in 1991 and the subsequent acquittal of the officers involved sparked a national conversation about police brutality and race. The 1992 Los Angeles riots, which erupted in response to the verdict, exposed the raw anger and frustration simmering beneath the surface of American society. More than 2 decades later, the death of George Floyd, a black man who died after a Minneapolis police officer knelt on his neck for over 9 minutes, ignited a wave of protests across the globe, reigniting the debate about police violence, systemic racism, and the urgent need for reform. Section 7. The Ferguson Effect, Fact or Fiction? In the wake of the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent protests and unrest, some law enforcement officials and commentators began to talk about the Ferguson effect, arguing that increased scrutiny of police, fueled by social media and the Black Lives Matter movement, was leading to a rise in crime. Proponents of the Ferguson effect argued that officers, fearful of being second-guessed, disciplined, or even prosecuted for their actions, were becoming less proactive in high-crime neighborhoods, leading to an increase in criminal activity. Opponents argued that the Ferguson effect was a myth, a convenient scapegoat for law enforcement to deflect blame for rising crime rates. The reality is that there is no clear consensus among criminologists about the existence or extent of the Ferguson effect. Crime rates fluctuate for a variety of complex reasons, and it is difficult to isolate the impact of any single factor, including changes in police behavior. The deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans at the hands of police in 2020 sparked a national reckoning on race and policing, leading to renewed calls for defunding the police. The Defund the Police movement, which gained significant traction in the wake of these tragedies, is not a monolithic entity with a single, universally agreed-upon demand. Rather, it encompasses a range of ideas and proposals aimed at fundamentally reimagining public safety. At its core, the defund movement argues that the traditional model of policing, with its emphasis on law enforcement, arrests, and incarceration, is ineffective, unjust, and disproportionately harmful to communities of color. Defund proponents advocate for redirecting funds away from police departments and towards community-based alternatives, such as mental health services, drug treatment programs, affordable housing, and job training. The defund movement has sparked intense debate and controversy, with supporters arguing that it is long overdue and opponents claiming that it will lead to chaos and lawlessness. The reality is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the complex challenges of public safety. Section 9. The challenges of reform, resistance, and backlash. Despite widespread recognition of the need for police reform, efforts to implement meaningful change have often been met with resistance and backlash, both from within law enforcement and from segments of the public. Police unions, often powerful political forces, have fought against measures that they perceive as threats to their members' jobs, benefits, or autonomy. Some law enforcement officials have argued that reforms such as stricter use of force policies or the implementation of body cameras will make it more difficult for officers to do their jobs effectively and will embolden criminals. Others have resisted calls for greater accountability and transparency, arguing that they undermine police morale and erode public trust. Public opinion on police reform is complex and often divided along racial and political lines. While there is broad support for some reforms, such as banning chokeholds or requiring body cameras, other proposals, such as defunding the police or reducing mandatory minimum sentences, have proven more controversial. Restoring trust, a long and arduous path. Rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential for creating a safer and more just society. This is a long and arduous process that requires a multifaceted approach, addressing issues of systemic racism, implicit bias, use of force, accountability, transparency, and community engagement. One crucial step is acknowledging and addressing the historical and ongoing legacy of racism and discrimination within law enforcement. This requires confronting implicit bias, both within individual officers and within the systems and structures of policing. Another essential component is reforming police training and education. Officers need to be equipped with the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to engage with diverse communities respectfully and effectively. This includes training on de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, implicit bias, and conflict resolution. Section 11. The future of policing, a crossroads of hope and uncertainty. The future of policing in America is at a crossroads. The convergence of social, political, and technological forces has created both unprecedented challenges and unique opportunities for transforming law enforcement. The choices made today will have a profound impact on the relationship between police and the communities they serve for generations to come. One path leads towards further militarization, surveillance, and the erosion of civil liberties. This path, fueled by fear, distrust, and a belief that the only solution to crime is more force and control, risks creating a society where police are viewed as an occupying force rather than as protectors. The other path leads towards a more just, equitable, and humane system of public safety. This path, grounded in principles of community policing, restorative justice, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of crime, offers the possibility of a future where police are viewed as partners, guardians, and peacemakers. Section 1. The enduring legacy, a reckoning yet to be fulfilled. The history of crime and corruption in American law enforcement is a long and troubled one, a somber narrative woven into the very fabric of the nation. From the patronage-ridden police forces of the 19th century to the systemic racism and brutality that continue to plague communities of color today, the pursuit of justice in America has been a story of both progress and profound disappointment. We have witnessed moments of reckoning, times when the nation's conscience was shocked by the brutality of corrupt officers and the systemic failures that allowed them to flourish. Commissions have been formed, reports have been written, and reforms have been implemented, yet the cycle of abuse and outrage persists. The roots of this crisis run deep, entangled with America's original sins of slavery and racism, and nurtured by a culture that often prizes order and control over justice and equality. The legacy of this history continues to cast a long shadow, shaping the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve, particularly communities of color who have borne the brunt of police misconduct. Section 2. The price of injustice, a nation divided, a trust betrayed. The cost of this enduring legacy is immeasurable, paid in shattered lives, broken families, and a deeply eroded trust in the very institutions meant to protect and serve. Every instance of police brutality, every act of corruption, every miscarriage of justice deepens the divide between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to protect. This distrust has real and devastating consequences. It discourages victims from reporting crimes, witnesses from coming forward, and communities from cooperating with law enforcement efforts. It fosters a climate of fear and suspicion, where interactions with police are often fraught with anxiety and the threat of violence. The erosion of trust in law enforcement is not simply a law enforcement problem, it is a societal crisis. When faith in the justice system falters, so too does faith in the very foundations of democracy. It undermines the rule of law, fuels cynicism and despair, and makes it infinitely more difficult to build a just and equitable society. Section 3. The path forward towards a justice worthy of its name. The challenges ahead are daunting, but we cannot afford to surrender to cynicism or despair. The road to justice is long and fraught with obstacles, but it is a journey we must undertake with determination and hope. Every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a society where justice is not just an ideal, but a lived reality for all. The pursuit of justice requires a sustained and unwavering commitment to reform, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and a fundamental reimagining of the role of law enforcement in a democratic society. It means looking beyond the surface and addressing the deep-seated issues that have long been ignored. It means listening to the voices of those who have been marginalized and oppressed and taking their experiences and perspectives seriously. This journey begins with acknowledging and addressing the systemic racism, implicit bias, and culture of impunity that continue to plague many law enforcement agencies. We must recognize that these issues are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that has been perpetuated over generations. By shining a light on these injustices, we can begin to dismantle the structures that uphold them and create a more equitable system for all. It requires investing in community-based alternatives to policing, addressing the root causes of crime, and creating a system of accountability that holds officers to the highest ethical standards. This means providing resources and support for mental health services, education, and economic opportunities so that communities can thrive without the need for heavy-handed policing. It also means ensuring that those who are tasked with upholding the law are held to the same standards as the rest of us, and that they are held accountable when they fall short. We need to move beyond the tired rhetoric of a few bad apples and recognize that true reform requires a fundamental shift in culture, training, and accountability. This means rethinking how we train our law enforcement officers and ensuring that they are equipped with the skills and knowledge they need to serve their communities effectively and compassionately. It also means fostering a culture of transparency and accountability, where officers are encouraged to speak out against misconduct and are supported when they do. This will require political will, community engagement, and the courage to challenge the status quo. It means electing leaders who are committed to justice reform and holding them accountable to their promises. It means building coalitions across different communities and working together towards a common goal. And it means being willing to take risks and make sacrifices in the name of justice. This is not a battle for one community or one group of people. It is a fight for the soul of America. It is a fight for the values that we hold dear. and for the future that we want to create for ourselves and for future generations. It is a fight that requires all of us to stand together, to support one another, and to never give up, no matter how difficult the road ahead may be. The time for incremental change has long passed. We need bold, transformative action that addresses the root causes of injustice and creates a system that truly serves all of its citizens. This means rethinking our approach to public safety and investing in the programs and services that will create healthier, safer communities. It means holding those in power accountable and ensuring that they are working in the best interests of the people they serve. We need a justice system worthy of its name, a system that truly protects and serves all of its citizens without fear or favor. This means creating a system that is fair, transparent, and accountable, and that treats everyone with dignity and respect. It means ensuring that justice is not just a privilege for the few, but a right for all. And it means working together as a society to build a future where justice is not just an aspiration, but a reality.